I've always been a light sleeper. Every creak of the floor, every distant car engine, it all stirs me awake. That night, though, it wasn't the usual noises that pulled me from sleep. It was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. There was a tension in the air, like a current of electricity, a sense that I wasn't alone. I opened my eyes to darkness, but immediately I felt it. Presence. First, I lay there, frozen, listening. The house was quiet, eerily so. The only sound was the faint hum of the heating system and the soft ticking of the clock on my nightstand. But then I heard it. Faint, rhythmic tapping. I dismissed it as wind against the window. Winter nights can be strange like that. The cold plays tricks on you, makes the world outside seem alive, but it didn't stop. It wasn't random like wind or tree branches. No, it was deliberate. Tap, tap, right outside my window. I sat up slowly, my heart racing now, each beat louder in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe a branch had come loose in the wind. But deep down, I knew better. There was no wind that night. The curtains were slightly parted, just enough to see the faint outline of the window through the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I even wanted to know what was outside, but curiosity won. I had to look. When I did, I felt my breath catch in my throat. There, just inches from the glass, was a face. Pale, ghostly in the moonlight, eyes wide open and unblinking. It was staring right at me. No expression, no movement, just staring. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Who was this? Why were they there? My bedroom was on the second floor. There shouldn't have been anyone outside my window, and yet there they were, watching me as if waiting for something. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I wanted to believe it had been a bad dream, some twisted hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the image of that face, pale, motionless, eyes fixed on me, was burned into my mind. The next morning, I stood by the window, staring out at the spot where the face had been. I opened the window, leaned out, and looked down. Nothing. There was no sign that anyone had been there. No footprints in the snow, no ladder leaning against the side of the house. But I knew what I had seen. That night, I triple-checked every lock before going to bed. I pulled the curtains shut tight and made sure they wouldn't part again. I even left the bedside lamp on, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Still, sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. The groan of the pipes, the ticking of the clock, it all felt wrong. Like something was out there, waiting. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, there was no tapping at the window. No obvious reason for me to have woken up. But the room felt cold, much colder than it should have been. I got up, walked over to the thermostat. The heat was on, but the air in my room felt like ice. That's when I noticed it. The window, the one I had locked, it was slightly open, just enough for a draft to come through. My heart started pounding again, that same paralyzing fear from the night before rushing back. I knew I had locked it. I was certain. I rushed over, slammed it shut, and locked it again. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I felt, watched, that same sensation from before. Like eyes were on me, but from where? I scanned the room, every shadow, every corner, empty. The feeling didn't go away. The next few days were uneventful, but the tension was building. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I hadn't locked the window as well as I thought. Maybe it was just the wind. But in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't true. Things started to change after that. Little things. I'd come home from work and find objects in places I hadn't left them. The remote would be on the couch when I knew I'd left it on the coffee table. The kitchen chair would be pulled out, though I always pushed it in after eating. I even started losing things. Keys, my phone, small items that I swore I'd put in the same spot every day, only to find them later in completely different places. One night, as I was locking up before bed, I noticed the front door. The deadbolt was unlocked. I had no memory of unlocking it. I stared at it for a long time, trying to recall if maybe, somehow, I'd forgotten to lock it earlier, but I knew I hadn't. My routine had become obsessive at this point. Every lock, every window, checked over and over again. It wasn't just inside the house. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, movement, a shadow darting past a window. figure standing far down the street, just barely visible in the dim light. Every time I looked directly, it was gone. The worst part was that feeling of being watched. Constant, oppressive, like someone or something was observing my every move, waiting for me to let my guard down. I would feel it the most at night, when the house was silent. Sometimes I'd lie in bed for hours, listening for any sign that someone was there, just outside the door. Quiet had become suffocating, filled with the tension of anticipation. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining things, jumping at shadows. But deep down, I knew something or someone was here, and it wasn't going to leave. The unease had turned into something far worse. It wasn't just the small things anymore. Now, it felt like my life had been invaded, like someone had crossed an invisible line between the outside world and my private space. I no longer felt safe in my own home. The walls that once kept the outside world at bay were now nothing more than thin barriers, as if whoever or whatever was had seeped through the cracks and taken up residence inside with me. A week after I first saw the face at the window, things escalated. It was around midnight. I'd just crawled into bed after another restless day, every muscle in my body tense with exhaustion. I had stopped leaving the bedside lamp on. It wasn't helping anymore. Darkness had become a part of my life, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I closed my eyes and tried to drift off when I heard it. Footsteps, not outside, not in the distance, inside the house. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound was unmistakable, soft, deliberate steps moving slowly down the hallway. My heart raced as I strained to listen, each step louder, closer. It wasn't the creaking of the house settling, it was someone walking. I bolted upright, my mind trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I'd locked every door, every window. I was sure of it, but those footsteps, they were real. I grabbed the bat I had started keeping next to my bed and crept toward the bedroom door. My hands were trembling, slick with sweat. I wrapped my fingers around the doorknob. I listened again, barely breathing. The footsteps had stopped. I opened the door just a crack, peeking into the hallway. It was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Nothing moved. The house was silent again, but I knew what I had heard. I stepped into the hallway, my feet sinking into the soft carpet as I moved cautiously. Every nerve in my body was on edge. The silence was thick, unnatural. Felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting. As I passed the bathroom, I stopped. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see inside. The mirror above the sink reflected only darkness. There was something else, something wrong. I pushed the door open a bit more and froze. The window, the small bathroom window, the one that I never opened, was wide open. Cold air rushed in, sending a shiver down my spine. I backed out of the room, too afraid to check further. If the window was open, how had it been opened? Someone must have come inside. My mind raced, and I couldn't stop thinking about that face at the window. Was it the same person? Were they in the house now, watching me from some hidden corner? That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they weren't soft and slow. They were hurried, almost frantic, coming from downstairs. Someone, or something, was running through the house. I sprinted to the stairs, the bat clutched tightly in my hand. My feet pounded against the wood as I descended, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. But when I reached the bottom, the house was empty. The front door was still locked. The windows were closed. Everything was as it should have been. But those footsteps, they were real. I wasn't imagining it. I turned on every light in the house, pacing through each room, trying to find anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no misplaced object. It was as if the house itself was playing tricks on me, bending reality just enough to keep me on the edge. I sat down on the couch, the bat still in my hand, trying to calm my breathing. My head was spinning, the fear now a constant, gnawing presence in my gut. That's when I felt it again, that oppressive sensation of being watched. It was stronger this time, almost suffocating. I stood up, scanning the room. Nothing. I walked to the window, pulling the curtains back to look outside, desperate for some explanation, some sign that this was all in my head. But then I saw it. Across the street, standing in the shadow of a tree, was a figure. Too far away to make out details, but close enough for me to feel the chill creep up my spine. Didn't move, just stood there. It was waiting for me to notice. I stared for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Was this the same person, the one from the window, or was it someone else? And why were they watching me? I took a step back, my hand shaking as I let the curtain fall. I didn't want to look anymore, didn't want to know. But that feeling, that deep, primal fear, wouldn't let go. The worst part wasn't the footsteps or the open window, even the figure outside. It was the realization that I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted, and whatever it wasn't going to stop. Not until it got inside. I barely slept after that night. Figure outside, the open windows, the footsteps, I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I started keeping every light on, moving from room to room like a prisoner in my own home, always watching my back. But it didn't help. Feeling of being watched was constant, like eyes boring into me from the darkness, just out of sight. It was 3 nights later when things took a turn for the worse. I had been sitting in the living room trying to distract myself with TV, but every sound seemed to pull me back into that gnawing sense of dread. The house creaked as it always did, but now every creak felt like a signal, like someone was moving around just beyond the walls. That night, power went out. It was sudden. 1 second, the lights and TV were on, and the next, complete darkness swallowed the room. My heart lurched into my throat as I fumbled for my phone, its faint glow the only thing keeping the crushing blackness at bay. I told myself it was just a blown fuse, maybe something with the breaker. But deep down I knew this wasn't a coincidence. I grabbed the bat from next to the couch and stood, my legs shaky, my body tense. I held the phone out in front of me, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. I was trying to think clearly, figure out what to do when I heard it. The breathing. It was faint, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. Someone was in the house with me. I froze, every muscle locked in place as I strained to listen. It was coming from behind me. Slow, shallow breaths, like they were trying to stay quiet but couldn't control it entirely. My mind raced. No footsteps, no door opening. How could someone be inside without me knowing? I turned slowly, my phone casting its weak beam toward the kitchen. Nothing. Breathing continued, steady, almost rhythmic now, like whoever it was just standing there watching me. Waiting. I called out, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" No response. I took a step forward, the bat gripped tightly in my hand. My eyes scanned the room, every shadow a potential threat. But there was no one, at least not that I could see. But the breathing was still there, following me, always just behind, as if it was moving when I moved, staying just out of sight. I turned quickly, swinging the phone around to catch whoever or whatever was behind me. Nothing. The room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat dripped down my back. I felt like I was losing my mind. But the breathing, it was real. It had to be. I could hear it, feel it, like it was right there. But when I looked, nothing. Panic set in. I bolted for the front door, but the moment I reached it, the door wouldn't budge. Locked from the inside, the same lock I had checked 1,000 times. I fumbled with the handle, my hands shaking, trying to get it open, but it was stuck. Something was wrong. It was like the house was trapping me inside, holding me here with whatever was following me. The breathing grew louder, almost right against my neck. I spun around, raising the bat, ready to swing at whatever had gotten so close. There was nothing, just the dark, empty room. I backed up against the door, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles went white. I didn't know what to do, where to go. There was nowhere to run, and whatever was in the house with me wasn't human. Couldn't be. How could it be everywhere and nowhere at once? How could it move without making a sound, except for that God-forsaken breathing? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to get control of this. I had to think clearly. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the stress, the sleepless nights, the paranoia, it had finally gotten to me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the breathing wouldn't stop. And suddenly, it was gone. The silence that followed was even worse. The kind of silence that presses down on you heavy and thick, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I didn't dare move. I just stood there, bat in hand, my back against the door, staring into the empty room. And that's when I saw it. In the dim light of my phone, just barely visible, a figure, tall, thin, with long limbs, standing in the corner of the room, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. Its face was obscured in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing, locking me in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step, then another. The breathing started again, loud and ragged, filling the room as the figure came closer. I raised the bat, my hands shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could even swing it. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. The figure paused, then stopped completely, just a few feet from me. Its face still hidden, its body unnaturally still. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound, a low, guttural whisper that filled my mind, sending a wave of cold terror down my spine. It didn't need to say anything. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me. The figure stood there, just feet away from me, the sound of its breathing crawling through the darkness like it was alive, filling every corner of the room. My grip on the bat tightened, but I was paralyzed with fear. The air had grown so thick it felt like I was drowning in it. The low, guttural whisper from the thing before me echoed in my head, repeating over and over like a twisted lullaby. I backed up against the door, knowing there was nowhere to go. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, towering over me, its face still obscured, its breathing slow and deliberate. I could feel my own breath coming in shallow gasps, my pulse thundering in my ears, but the figure didn't care. It was waiting for me to do something, anything. Suddenly, I had a flash of clarity. This thing, this entity, wasn't human. I had been trying to rationalize it, make sense of it, but now I understood. Whatever it was, it had been watching me, stalking me, not just for days or weeks, but longer, much longer. In a panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I swung the bat, aiming directly at where its face should have been. But the moment the bat passed through the air, the figure vanished, dissipating into the shadows like smoke. The force of the swing knocked me off balance, and I stumbled forward, crashing into the wall. I whipped around, expecting the figure to reappear behind me, but the room was empty. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, that maybe I had driven it away, but that hope lasted only a second. The breathing started again, this time closer, like it was right behind me. I spun around, desperate to find the source, but instead of the figure, something else caught my eye. Across the room, on the far wall, was something I had never noticed before. A photo. It was one of those old, faded pictures you forget you have, tucked into the corner of a frame. But this photo, it wasn't just old, it was familiar in the worst way. I walked toward it, my steps slow and hesitant, as if getting closer would somehow make everything worse. My hands were trembling as I reached out to pull the photo from the frame. I held it under the dim light of my phone and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a picture of me as a child. I must have been around 8 or 9, standing outside my old house, smiling with that innocent, carefree look kids always have. But it wasn't me in the photo that terrified me. It was what was standing behind me. There, in the background, partially obscured by the shadows of the house, was the figure. All thin, with that same unnaturally long body, its face blurred, hidden in the shade. But the eyes, those same cold, piercing eyes, were visible, staring directly at me. Even then, I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat. How was this possible? How could it have been there, watching me all those years ago? I tore through the other photos in the frame, my hands shaking, pulling out every picture I could find. And in every single one, birthday parties, family vacations, even random snapshots from school, the figure was there. Always in the background, always watching. Sometimes just a shadow, other times clearer, but it was always the same height, the same posture, and those eyes. This thing, it had been following me my entire life. I stumbled back, dropping the photos to the floor, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt like it was spinning, the air too thin, too cold. Couldn't breathe. How had I never noticed? How could it have been there, always lurking, always watching, without me knowing? Then it hit me, a memory I hadn't thought of in years. When I was a kid, I used to tell my parents I had nightmares about someone standing outside my window. I would wake up in the middle of the night, crying, swearing there was a man with long arms and no face just watching me through the glass. My parents had chalked it up to childish imagination, told me it was just a bad dream. But it wasn't. I hadn't been imagining it. I had been seeing it. And now, after all these years, it was back. No, it had never left. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to make itself known, waiting for me to remember. The breathing grew louder again, but this time it wasn't just a sound. I could feel it. Hot, damp air against the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding, knowing what I would see. Figure was there. Closer now, standing just inches from me, towering over me. Its face was clearer now, but still obscured by shadows, its eyes burning into mine. The whispers filled my head again, louder this time, demanding, consuming. And then it reached out. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in place as the figure's long, skeletal hand reached for me. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with fear, the walls pressing in. As its hand touched my shoulder, everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying on the cold floor. The house was silent again, the oppressive feeling gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The figure wasn't gone. It was just waiting, hiding in the shadows, biding its time. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone.